had been driving for almost 7 hours when I finally saw the turnoff. The dirt road was half hidden by overgrown weeds and tilted signposts that hadn't been touched in years. I pulled over and checked the map I had printed out, an old one I found in a box at my uncle's place. According to it, the road led to a small cabin deep in the woods, one that hadn't been used since the early 1980s. My uncle told me once that he had gone there hunting when he was younger, but nobody had cared about the place for decades. It was late October, 1997. The air already felt like winter was creeping in. I was 28 at the time and restless, looking for something different. The idea of staying in an abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere felt like a strange way to clear my head. I figured I would take a couple of days, bring some food, and see if the cabin still had anything left inside. I wasn't expecting much, but I was curious. The dirt road was rough, covered in potholes and thick roots that cracked through the surface. My old pickup truck rattled every few seconds. Branches scraped along the sides, making that sharp sound like nails on metal. The deeper I went, the less the road looked like a road. It was more like a trail now, and the trees leaned in close overhead, blocking out the late afternoon light. By the time I finally saw the cabin, I felt like I had been swallowed whole by the woods. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines and bare oaks. The roof sagged on one side, the wood panels were gray and split, and the front porch leaned forward like it could collapse any second. A broken rocking chair sat in one corner, frozen in place, covered in moss. The windows were caked with dirt, some cracked, one completely missing, leaving only a black hole where the glass used to be. I parked the truck and killed the engine. The silence hit me harder than I expected. No cars, no people, not even the sound of wind. Just the dull creak of trees shifting in place. I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and stepped up onto the porch. The boards groaned under my weight, and one nearly snapped clean through. The front door wasn't locked, but it stuck. I shoved my shoulder into it and it swung open, the smell of mildew and rot pushing out like a wall. The inside was worse than I thought. Dust hung in the air like smoke. Spider webs stretched across the corners, and the wooden floor had warped from years of damp weather. An old wood stove sat in the corner, rusted shut. A table with one leg missing leaned against the wall, and what looked like a torn blanket was draped over it. I set my bag down and walked through the rooms. There were only two: the main room and a smaller back room that looked like it had been used as a bedroom. The bed frame was still there, rusted metal twisted out of shape, with what was left of a mattress collapsed in the middle. The smell was stronger there, like something had been left too long. I stepped back into the main room and opened the one window that wasn't jammed shut. Cold air rolled in, cutting through the must. The sun was already dropping lower, the sky turning gray through the trees. I unpacked a little, laid out my sleeping bag on the floor in the main room, and lit a lantern I had brought. I had no plans for the night except to stay put, maybe take a look around in the morning. But I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound carried. The woods around me were alive, branches snapping, leaves shifting, animals moving. But then there were heavier sounds, like something stepping in slow, uneven patterns outside. I told myself it was a deer or maybe just the trees bending, but I kept waking up every hour, listening. Once, near 2 in the morning, I swore I heard footsteps on the porch, a faint creak followed by silence. I stayed still, breathing slow, my hand on the flashlight, but nothing happened. Eventually, I dozed off again. The next morning, I walked the area around the cabin. The ground was soft, and I noticed prints in the mud near the back. At first, I thought they were deer tracks, but the shape was wrong. These were boot prints, old ones, pressed deep but partly washed out by rain. They led into the woods, then vanished. I followed them for maybe 100 yards before losing them completely. The rest of the day I spent cleaning the inside, sweeping away debris with a broken branch I found. I tried to make the place at least livable. I boiled some canned food over a small burner I brought and sat on the floor, eating in silence. The longer I stayed, the heavier the air felt, like the woods pressed closer around the cabin each hour. That night was worse. Around midnight, I woke to a sound, metal scraping lightly, like something brushing against my truck. I sat up fast, heart pounding. I listened hard, and there it was again. A faint sound, like fingers dragging across the metal. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it through the broken window. Nothing. The truck sat there, a dark outline in the clearing. No movement, no sound now, but I couldn't shake it. By morning, I checked the truck. There were faint marks along the side. Thin, uneven scratches that hadn't been there before. Some looked fresh, bright against the faded paint. I stood there staring for a long time, my stomach tight. I thought about leaving then, but part of me didn't want to give in. I told myself it could have been branches or an animal. I decided to stay one more night. That evening, I built a small fire pit outside, just to keep my mind occupied. The fire crackled and the smoke rose, but it didn't feel comforting. It felt like a signal, like I was letting anyone nearby know exactly where I was. After an hour, I put it out and went back inside, locking the door with a piece of wood wedged against it. I barely slept at all. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again, the slow, deliberate steps across the porch. This time it didn't stop. The boards creaked one after another, moving from one end to the other. Then silence. I held my breath, clutching the flashlight, waiting for the door to move, but it never did. I sat there wide awake until the first gray light pushed through the trees. By sunrise, I made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bag quickly and stepped outside. The air was damp and cold, and the clearing looked different in the daylight. I glanced at the porch, the boards bent in places like weight had been on them recently. My chest tightened. When I got to the truck, I froze. In the mud beside the driver's door were fresh prints. Boots, clear, sharp edges, not old or washed away. Someone had been standing right there, close enough to touch the door. I threw my bag into the truck and got in, locking the doors. The engine coughed to life, and I turned the wheel hard, backing out of the clearing as fast as I could. The road back felt longer than before, every shadow between the trees shifting like it was alive. When I finally hit the main road, I didn't stop until I was 20 miles away. I pulled into a gas station, stepped out, and looked at the side of the truck again. The scratches ran deeper than I thought, some in long arcs, some short, jagged lines. They weren't branches. They were too deliberate. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was out there or how long they had been watching, but I know someone was. Those woods weren't empty. The cabin wasn't forgotten. And whoever left those prints had been waiting, moving just close enough to remind me I wasn't alone. That was the last time I ever stayed in a place like that. The memory still sticks with me. The silence, the prints, the feeling of eyes in the dark. And when I think back on it now, I know I left just in time. Because if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. It had been 7 years since I had seen the cabin. 7 years since the divorce, since the fights, since the day I swore I would never set foot near that place again. Yet here I was, on a cold evening in late October, driving down a cracked and uneven road that twisted through the pines and birches of northern Wisconsin. I told myself I was only passing through, that I didn't even need to stop, but the truth was I couldn't resist the pull. The cabin had once been my ex-husband Mark's pride. He bought it in 2009, just before we married, and he worked on it obsessively every summer. For a while, it felt like ours. A getaway from work, from the noise of town. But as the years went by, the cabin became his escape from me. When we split, he kept it in the settlement. I told myself I didn't care, but now, driving along that lonely road, my chest tightened as the trees opened to a clearing and the old shape came into view. The place looked different but still familiar. The green paint on the siding had peeled, exposing dull gray wood underneath. The shutters, once neat, hung crooked. The porch sagged lower than I remembered, and weeds choked the gravel path leading to the steps. The whole scene had an emptiness that made the air feel heavier. I pulled over, cutting the engine, and for a moment just sat there. The silence was thick, only broken by the ticking of the cooling car. No other houses were close, just forest and the shallow lake stretching out behind the trees. The sun was sinking, throwing orange light across the roof. I knew Mark had died 2 years ago, heart attack at 45, sudden and brutal. I hadn't gone to the funeral. I hadn't even called anyone. And yet, seeing the cabin sitting there alone, it struck me harder than I expected. I got out. The air was damp, carrying that sharp bite of fall that crawls through your jacket. Leaves covered the ground in layers, crunching under my shoes as I walked up, my mind flooded with memories. Sitting on that porch with a beer in hand, waiting for him to finish chopping wood. The smell of damp pine boards when we first moved in furniture. Arguments muffled behind closed windows. All of it mixed together, heavy and bitter. I hadn't planned to go inside, but standing there, staring at the door, I found my hand reaching for the knob. The metal felt cold, gritty with rust, turned easier than I expected. The inside smelled like stale wood and dust. I stepped into the main room, and the old layout came back to me instantly. The living space opened wide, with the stone fireplace to the right, the narrow kitchen tucked against the far wall, and a hallway leading to the bedroom and bathroom. Everything was darker, dirtier. The furniture was still there, the couch, the table, the bookshelf, but covered in a thin coat of grime. Cobwebs hung in the corners. The silence was so deep I could hear my own breathing, steady but shallow. I ran my hand along the edge of the table, feeling the dust cling to my skin. A mug still sat on the counter, cracked down one side. Papers were scattered across the table. Unpaid bills, faded envelopes. He must have let the place go in his last years. I pictured him sitting here alone, drinking, ignoring the stack of mail, and the thought made my stomach twist. I walked further in. The bedroom door was open, the bed unmade, the sheets yellowed. His boots sat by the closet, tipped on their sides like he had kicked them off one last time and never picked them up. A shaving kit lay on the dresser, untouched. I could almost see him here, moving around the room, pulling on a jacket, cursing under his breath. The ghost of daily life, but not in the supernatural sense. Just the traces a person leaves behind when they live somewhere long enough. As I stood there, I realized how vulnerable I felt. The woods outside pressed close, and the fading daylight through the windows only made the shadows stretch. The cabin creaked in the wind, the boards shifting. I felt a sharp urge to leave, but something kept me rooted. Maybe it was anger, maybe pity, maybe just the strange pull of places tied to old wounds. I went back into the main room and noticed the door to the basement. We rarely used it when we were married. It was damp, unfinished, more like a storage hole than anything else. I stared at it for a long time before pulling it open. The smell hit me immediately. Mildew, rot, the wet earth smell that clings to forgotten spaces. The stairs groaned as I stepped down. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, catching on boxes stacked against the walls. Old tools leaned in the corner. There was water pooled in spots on the floor, glinting in the light. I moved slowly, shining the beam across the room. Then it landed on something that froze me. Along the far wall, tucked behind the shelves, were several large plastic containers, sealed tight with duct tape. They looked out of place, too deliberate. I stepped closer, my chest tightening. One had been partially opened, and inside were old clothes, folded sloppily. Another held what looked like empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and scraps of paper. Not dangerous, but strange. Like someone had been living down here in secret, hoarding garbage. I thought about Mark, how he had withdrawn, how no one really knew what he did in his final years. Maybe he came down here when he wanted to be alone, hiding things away, slipping further into himself. I tried to imagine the silence of this basement at night, only the dripping water and the scuttle of mice. The weight of it pressed down on me until I could hardly breathe. I left the containers untouched and climbed back up, my hands shaking slightly. The air upstairs felt fresher, but the unease clung to me. I realized how late it had gotten. The sky outside had gone purple, the last light fading fast. I didn't want to be stuck out here in the dark. I stepped outside and locked the door behind me, though I doubted the lock worked properly anymore. Standing there in the clearing, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The place seemed smaller now, shrunken, stripped of the power it once held over me. It wasn't a home anymore. It wasn't even Mark's anymore. It was just a rotting shell, full of dust and silence and strange reminders of a life that had collapsed. As I walked back to the car, I realized I wasn't scared of the cabin itself. What unsettled me was what it revealed, the way time and solitude could hollow someone out, leaving only scraps behind. Mark had died young, but in a way he had already been disappearing long before that. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The headlights lit the dirt path ahead, cutting through the trees. As I pulled away, the cabin vanished into the shadows behind me, swallowed by the woods. The whole drive back, I thought about how I had avoided this place for years, imagining it as something larger, darker, more threatening than it really was. In the end, it was just a decaying building with traces of a man I once knew. The fear wasn't in the walls or the basement. It was in facing the truth of what time does to people, and how easily a life can fall apart when left to rot. By the time I reached the main road, I felt lighter. I had seen it, faced it, and left it behind. The cabin would sit out there until it collapsed into the ground, but it wasn't mine to carry anymore. I had been living in the city for most of my life, but after my father passed, I decided to take some time away from everything. I was 36 then, and the noise, traffic, and constant movement of the city had worn me down. My father had owned a small piece of land in the countryside, about 40 miles outside of Asheville, North Carolina. On that land was an old cabin he built with his own hands back in the late 70s. It was never fancy, just 2 rooms, a wood stove, and a porch that faced a stretch of rolling fields. I remembered visiting it when I was young, but it had been nearly 20 years since I last stepped inside. I drove out there one evening in late September of 2016, just before the weather started to turn. The road narrowed the further I went, until it was nothing but gravel weaving between thick trees. My old pickup rattled along, and the sound of rocks crunching under the tires was the only thing cutting through the still air. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dropping low, painting the sky orange and purple. The cabin looked exactly how I remembered it, but more tired. The wood had gone dark from years of rain, and the roof sagged a little on one side. Weeds and wild grass had grown up past my knees in some places, brushing against my legs as I carried my bag to the porch. The door stuck, but after a hard push, it opened. The smell inside hit me first: dust, dry wood, and something faintly sour, like old leaves that had been left in water. I set my bag down and walked through the place slowly. There wasn't much. A table, 2 chairs, the iron stove, and a narrow bed frame with a mattress that had sagged in the middle. I had brought my own sleeping bag, knowing I wouldn't trust that mattress. The windows were streaked with dirt, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavier than it should. After unloading my things, I stepped back outside to take in the air. Out there, the fields stretched into the tree line, and beyond that was nothing but hills and woods. I didn't see another house, didn't hear a single car. Just the faint hum of crickets and the occasional call of a bird heading back to its roost. My dog, Scout, a brown mixed breed I'd had for 6 years, trotted around sniffing at everything with his nose to the ground. He was excited, running in short bursts, but he never strayed too far. The first night was calm. I lit a lantern, heated up some canned soup on the stove, and sat listening to the crickets outside. Scout curled up by my feet, breathing heavy in his sleep. The wind rattled the branches against the cabin, but that was it. I remember thinking maybe this trip was exactly what I needed. A few weeks away from people, deadlines, and noise. The second night changed that. I had been chopping some wood during the late afternoon and stacking it against the cabin. The sun dipped quicker than I thought, and by the time I got inside, the sky was already dim. I ate, washed up with some bottled water I'd brought, and settled into the sleeping bag on the floor. Scout lay beside me as always, but around midnight, he lifted his head. His ears perked, and he let out a low growl. I sat up, listening. First, I thought it was just the wind again, but then I heard it. Not wind, not animals. Footsteps, slow, steady, crunching through the gravel path just outside the cabin. My chest tightened. Out here, no one had any reason to walk around at night. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I reached for the flashlight beside me, clicked it on, and shined it toward the window. Nothing. The sound stopped. Scout kept growling, his nose pointed at the door. I stayed awake for hours, holding my breath at every small creak and snap outside. Nothing else happened, though. When the sky lightened to gray, I finally let myself rest. The next day, I walked around the cabin to check. The grass was flattened in a line leading from the tree line to the gravel path. Not trampled, just pushed down enough that it didn't look natural. I told myself it could have been a deer. Plenty of deer lived out here. But when I crouched down, I saw the shape. A boot print. It wasn't big, but it was clear enough in the softer dirt near the porch. Someone had been walking around my cabin. That night, I stayed awake longer, keeping the lantern low and listening. Scout didn't sleep either, his head up most of the time, ears turning at every sound. Around 2 in the morning, the footsteps came again. This time, closer, circling the cabin. Gravel crunched, grass shifted, and at one point, I heard the porch step creak under weight. My skin went cold. I held the flashlight tight, but I didn't shine it. I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake. I sat there in the dark, listening as the steps moved away after what felt like hours. My mind spun. Why would anyone be out here? The next morning, I checked again. More prints, this time all around the cabin. Someone had walked a full circle, stopping at the windows. I could see where the weeds had bent down as if someone had leaned close. By the third night, my nerves were shot. I thought about leaving, but something in me wanted to see who it was, to get proof I wasn't losing my mind. I parked my truck a short walk away, hidden behind a thick stand of trees, in case I needed to drive out quick. Then I sat inside with the lantern off, the flashlight ready, and Scout by my side. It didn't take long. Right after midnight, the sound came again. Steps, slow and steady. My heart pounded. I forced myself not to move, not to breathe too loud. The steps circled, then stopped at the door. I heard the handle jiggle, soft but deliberate. My throat went dry. Scout growled, a deep rumble that filled the small room. The sound stopped. Whoever it was didn't push further. Instead, the steps moved to the window again. That's when I finally snapped. I shined the flashlight straight at the glass. For a split second, I caught him. A man's face, pale in the beam, eyes wide. He jerked back, and I heard the rapid crunch of footsteps pounding toward the trees. Scout barked and lunged at the door, clawing at it. I didn't chase. I sat frozen, gripping the flashlight until my hand ached. I waited until dawn before stepping outside. The prints led back to the tree line, deep and messy from running. I followed them a short way, but they vanished into the thick brush. I didn't sleep after that. I packed my things, loaded Scout into the truck, and left the cabin behind. On the drive back, my hands shook on the wheel. The silence of the countryside, which had once felt peaceful, now felt suffocating. I never went back to that cabin. A month later, I put the land up for sale. The buyer never asked questions, and I never offered any. I told myself it was just some drifter, maybe a hunter who got too close. But the way he circled, the way he came back night after night, told me it wasn't random. Even now, years later, when I wake in the middle of the night, I sometimes hear the sound of gravel crunching in my head, slow and steady, like boots circling in the dark. The rain had been coming down steady all day, the kind that soaks into the ground and leaves everything smelling of wet earth and pine. By the time evening rolled in, the clouds hadn't moved an inch, and the sound of water dripping from the branches above was constant. I was 34 that year, in 1998, and I had made up my mind to finally build myself a small cabin out in the woods near the northern edge of Vermont. It wasn't much more than an idea for the longest time, but I had gathered enough lumber, tools, and stubbornness to start working on it that fall. The cabin was meant to be simple, just a single-room shelter that would keep me dry, with a roof I could trust and walls that didn't let the cold bite straight through. Nothing fancy, nothing decorative. I had carried most of the boards by hand from the old truck I parked about a half-mile down the rough path, hauling them through the brush and mud until my arms ached. I started building near a clearing, surrounded by tall spruce and maple, where the ground was solid enough but still hidden from the main road. By late afternoon, the rain had turned heavier. It wasn't a storm yet, but the kind of steady curtain that soaks through your jacket no matter how many times you shake it off. The smell of damp bark was everywhere, and the sound of the hammer hitting nails felt strange and hollow against the silence of the woods. I had already put up 3 walls, nailed together rough but tight enough to hold. The roof was barely a frame, just a set of beams with tarps thrown over them to keep my tools from getting ruined. The light faded quick under those thick clouds. I lit a lantern I kept tucked in my pack, and its orange glow stretched across the wet boards and my muddy boots. I kept working even as my hands numbed, because I wanted at least one side sealed up before I stopped. The thought of sleeping out in the rain without shelter pressed me forward. But something about that night sat different. The woods felt heavier, like the rain was pressing everything down closer. The sound of branches snapping under the weight of water kept echoing around me, and every so often I thought I heard something more. A sharp crack that didn't sound like a tree, or the shuffle of weight through wet leaves. It was the sort of thing you brush off at first, telling yourself it's just nature, but each time I set a board down or paused with the hammer, I realized the silence wasn't complete. There were gaps in it, places where something was out of rhythm. I kept my eyes on the lantern light and the wood in front of me. The longer I worked, the more I felt the dark pushing in from all sides. The trees looked taller than they had in daylight, their black trunks stretching up like columns holding the sky. The rain was cold now, soaking down my collar. My shirt clung to my back, and the mud around my boots pulled each step harder than the last. By the time I stopped, the lantern showed a half-finished cabin with walls that leaned just enough to worry me. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I sat on a pile of scrap boards, catching my breath, when I heard it, clear this time. Not a branch, not rain. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the tree line behind me. I froze, not turning my head, just listening. The steps weren't rushed, but they were heavy enough to push water out of the mud with each press. I could hear it sucking back up when the weight lifted. The lantern flickered a little with the wet breeze, and in that moment I felt the back of my neck prickle. I turned then, slow, holding the hammer in my hand. The lantern's glow barely reached 20 feet out, and beyond that it was all shapes and shadows. Rain streaked through the light, making it even harder to see. The trees stood still, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I sat there, waiting, muscles tight, eyes locked on the darkness. The footsteps didn't come again right away. It was the kind of silence that dragged, long enough that you start doubting your own ears. But then, faint and steady, they started again, this time circling wider, just past the edge of light. I gripped the hammer tighter, the cold metal slipping in my wet palm. My heart pounded so loud I swore it would drown out the rain. Whoever was out there wasn't in any hurry, and that worried me more than anything. It meant they weren't lost and they weren't afraid. They were moving like they knew where they were going. The sound of footsteps stopped near the side of the cabin, maybe 10 feet away, right where the lantern light faded out. I didn't breathe. I kept my eyes locked on the shadows, waiting for any shape to move. The rain dripped louder on the tarp roof, but underneath that, I swore I heard breathing. I stood up, slow, every board under my boots creaking louder than I wanted it to. My hand shook around the hammer, but I didn't put it down. I thought about calling out, but something in me said not to. Instead, I took one step toward the edge of light. Nothing moved. Nothing showed itself. After a long moment, I stepped back, my chest tight. I didn't like the thought of turning my back to finish the night in that half-built cabin, not with someone standing out there in the dark watching. I grabbed my lantern and swung it around, the light spilling in every direction, but all it showed was the rain and trees. The woods felt alive with eyes, though. Every direction looked like it held something just out of reach. I packed my tools in a rush, stuffing them into the tarp, slinging my pack over my shoulder. I didn't even bother covering the boards. My only thought was to get back to the truck before the dark closed in completely. The walk back was worse. The rain came down harder, and the beam of the lantern swung with each step, lighting the mud and the trunks but never enough ahead. Every so often I heard those same footsteps, not too close but not far either, pacing me through the trees. Each time I stopped, they stopped. By the time I saw the faint silver of the truck through the brush, my hands were numb from gripping the hammer. I kept expecting something to move out of the trees, but nothing did. I threw my gear into the truck bed, slammed the door shut, and sat there with the lantern still glowing beside me, watching the woods until the rain blurred the windshield completely. I didn't go back to that cabin for weeks. When I finally worked up the nerve, the boards were still there, soaked and warped from the rain. Tools scattered, some rusting. But what froze me wasn't the damage. It was the prints in the mud, deep, human, circling the cabin over and over, pressed into the earth like someone had walked around it for hours. That night, I decided I wouldn't finish the cabin there. I hauled everything back piece by piece and moved further south, closer to the main road, where the woods didn't press in so thick. I built another cabin, stronger, safer, and I finished it. But even now, years later, I can still hear that slow, steady sound of footsteps in the rain, circling just beyond the lantern light. That half-built cabin rotted down to nothing, but I'll never forget the night I realized I wasn't the only one out there. I was 28 when I decided to spend some time alone at a small cabin deep in northern Arizona, not far from the edge of the Navajo reservation. It was the summer of 1999, hot during the day but still cold at night once the sun dropped behind the canyons. I had borrowed the cabin from a friend's uncle who hadn't been there in years. The roof leaked in spots, the windows didn't close right, and the wood stove still had soot thick as tar in the pipe. But I didn't mind. I just wanted quiet. I wanted to get away from the noise of Phoenix, the traffic, the city smell that clings to you even when you're out in the desert. The cabin sat in a clearing of pinyon pines and juniper, the dirt around it hardened by years of sun and wind. No real road led there, just a rutted two-track that forced me to crawl along in my pickup. Once I parked and shut the engine off, it was dead quiet except for cicadas in the trees and the occasional dry rattle of grasshoppers leaping through the brush. I spent the first day cleaning the inside. Dust covered everything. Mouse droppings lined the shelves. Old newspapers from the mid-'80s were stacked by the wood stove, yellowed and brittle. I swept, opened the windows to let the stale air out, and stacked firewood outside just in case the nights got colder than I expected. When the sun set, I cooked beans on a camp stove, sat on the front step, and watched the sky go black. Stars spread across the whole thing, so many it felt heavy to look at. I could hear coyotes far off, yipping in broken tones, carrying across the canyon. The second night was when I first noticed something strange. I had been sitting by the fire pit I'd built just off the porch. I'd brought my dog with me, a shepherd mix named Bandit, who usually barked at everything that moved. That night he went stiff suddenly, staring into the tree line, ears pulled tight back. His whole body shook with a low growl I had never heard from him before. I followed his eyes, but I saw nothing, just darkness pressed against the line of the trees. Still, the hair on my arms stood up. The air felt different, heavier, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I tried to calm Bandit, but he wouldn't sit down. His growl stayed steady, rumbling from deep in his chest. Finally, I dragged him inside, locked the door, and pulled the curtains shut. He kept pacing, nails clicking across the wooden floor, until long after midnight. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been just a deer, or maybe a coyote wandering close. Out here, that was normal. Still, something nagged at me, some part of me that remembered the stories I had heard as a kid. Stories about things in the desert that weren't supposed to be talked about. I pushed it out of my head. That evening, I walked down the wash a half-mile from the cabin. The sand was dry, cracked, with small lizards darting in and out of holes. I followed the wash until it curved and the trees blocked the view of the cabin. That was when I found tracks. At first I thought they were human, barefoot, widespread toes pressed deep into the sand. But they weren't right. They seemed too long, too thin, like the foot had been stretched. They wandered back and forth along the wash, then disappeared into the brush. I stood staring at them for a long time, Bandit pressed against my leg, whining. Something about those tracks unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I left quickly, the sound of every branch snapping behind me making me whip my head around. By the time I saw the cabin again through the trees, I was sweating though the air wasn't hot anymore. That night, the noises started. Not the normal sounds of animals, not the chirp of crickets or the cry of coyotes. These were heavier, slower. Something moved around the cabin, just outside the thin walls. I could hear steps in the dirt, deliberate circling. Bandit pressed himself under the bed and refused to come out, no matter how much I tried to pull him. Around midnight, I heard something worse. It was a sound that froze me. My own name whispered just outside the door. It wasn't loud, it wasn't shouted. It was low, almost too quiet to catch, but I heard it. The voice sounded like mine, but broken, stretched, wrong. I stayed completely still in the bed, muscles locked, heart hammering so loud I thought it would shake the whole cabin apart. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, there were more tracks in the dirt outside. Long, thin, barefoot impressions circling the cabin over and over. Some came right up to the porch steps. The next 2 days were the worst of my life. I barely ate. I barely moved from inside the cabin. Every night it came back, circling, whispering, sometimes tapping on the glass. I nailed boards across the windows with old scrap wood I found behind the cabin, but that didn't stop the sounds. Once, around 3 in the morning, I heard Bandit whimpering under the bed, then silence, and then my dog's voice. The sound of him barking, but it wasn't right. The bark was cracked, broken, like a recording played back at the wrong speed. I started to lose track of time. I kept the rifle I'd brought leaned against the wall, but I knew it wouldn't matter. What was out there wasn't afraid of bullets. It wasn't acting like an animal. It was playing with me, waiting. By the 5th night, I made up my mind I couldn't stay. I packed at dawn, as fast as I could, stuffing everything into bags without caring about order. I opened the door to leave and froze. On the porch, laid out in a perfect line, were dead animals. Rabbits, birds, even a coyote pup. Their bodies were twisted, broken, but not eaten. They had been placed there, lined up facing the door like a warning. My stomach turned. I shoved past, loaded the truck, and threw Bandit inside. He didn't bark, didn't make a sound, just pressed against the passenger door as if he wanted to melt through it. The drive back out felt endless. The 2-track was rough, the truck bounced and jolted, but I didn't dare slow down. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following. The woods seemed darker than they should have been, even in daylight. Shadows stretched too far, shapes lingered too long between the trees. When I finally hit pavement, I didn't stop. I drove all the way back to Phoenix without a break, only pulling into my driveway well after dark. I sat in the truck for a long time before I could get out, Bandit still trembling beside me. I never went back to that cabin. A month later, when I asked my friend about his uncle's place, he told me the old man had abandoned it decades earlier after strange things happened up there. He wouldn't say more, and I didn't press him. Now, years later, I still think about those nights. I try to tell myself it was exhaustion, isolation, my mind playing tricks. But then I remember the tracks, the animals, the voice that called my name in the dark, sounding almost like me but not. And I know deep down that whatever was circling that cabin wasn't just in my head. It was real, and it's still out there, waiting for someone else to stay in that place long enough to hear it. I was 26 the year I decided to rent out an old farm cabin on the edge of Nebraska. It was late September, 1998. The man who owned the land gave me a discount because he said no one wanted to stay out there anymore. Too quiet, too isolated, too run down for most people. For me, that was the exact reason I chose it. I needed to get away from the city noise, the bills piling up, and the constant arguments with people I thought were friends. I figured 2 months of silence on a farm would help me clear my head. The cabin sat a mile down a dirt road, tucked behind rows of dying corn stalks. The crop hadn't been harvested in years, so the stalks were dry, yellow, and brittle, whispering when the wind blew through them. The farmhouse itself wasn't standing anymore. It had burned down sometime in the 80s. What was left was this one-room wooden cabin near a broken windmill and an old barn that leaned heavily to one side like it was about to fall over. The cabin smelled like dust and mice when I first walked in. There was one bed frame with no mattress, a cracked wood stove, a chair with one leg shorter than the others, and a table scarred with cigarette burns. I swept it out, set up a sleeping bag, and told myself it was fine, just temporary. The first few nights were easy. I cooked canned beans on a small propane stove, read books by lantern light, and wrote in a notebook about how quiet everything was. Out there, you notice things you don't in the city. The way the night sounds like a living thing, how the barn groans when the wind pushes against it, how silence can feel heavier than noise. By the end of the first week, I noticed something strange. Every morning, when I stepped outside to walk around the fields, there were signs that someone or something had been there during the night. Not animals. The first time I saw it, it was just footprints in the dirt, leading from the edge of the field to the barn. Bare feet, not boots. They were small, not much bigger than mine, and pressed deep enough into the soil that they weren't from long ago. I told myself it was probably kids from town screwing around, maybe drinking out here at night. It wasn't their land, but it wasn't mine either. I tried to shrug it off. The second week, I started noticing things out of place. I'd leave my lantern on the table, and in the morning it would be set by the door. I'd stack my firewood, only to find the pile rearranged into odd shapes, like crooked crosses or messy circles. One night I woke up and realized my sleeping bag zipper had been pulled halfway down while I was asleep. I couldn't prove it wasn't me. Maybe I rolled over and did it without noticing, but I didn't feel like it was me. The nights grew harder. Every creak of the cabin made me sit up, heart pounding. The dry corn stalks outside brushed together constantly, a sound that could easily be mistaken for whispering voices if you were half asleep. Sometimes I thought I heard faint knocking on the walls, but when I sat up to listen, it would stop. One morning, I walked out and saw something that froze me solid. On the cabin wall, just beside the window, there were 4 long streaks of dirt smeared downward. Not like an animal's claw marks. More like someone with filthy hands had dragged their fingers down the wood while standing there, watching. That day, I checked the barn. I hadn't been inside before because the roof sagged and I didn't want it collapsing on me. But the door had been pushed open, so I forced myself to look. Inside it smelled like rot and mold. There were rusted tools scattered on the ground, a busted tractor, piles of straw turned black with age. But near the back, in a small cleared space, someone had been sleeping. There was a pile of blankets, a bucket filled with empty cans, and what looked like gnawed-on bones, probably from rabbits or squirrels. That's when it hit me. Someone was living out here. The thought made my skin crawl. It wasn't a ghost story or some animal messing around. It was a real person. Someone who crept around at night while I was asleep, touched my things, watched me through the window. Maybe they'd been out here long before I showed up. Maybe they thought this place was theirs. I wanted to pack my bag and leave right then, but I had no car. The landowner had dropped me off when I first came and promised to pick me up in November. The closest road was 3 miles away, and I wasn't even sure I could find it without getting lost in the maze of fields. So I stayed. The next week was hell. I barely slept. I pushed the chair against the door each night, though I knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined to come in. I kept my small camping hatchet by my sleeping bag. Every sound outside, footsteps in the dry dirt, corn cracking in the wind, made me sweat. I never saw anyone, but the proof piled up. More footprints, more rearranged firewood. Once, my food bag had been opened and half my cans were missing. The scariest night came near the end of October. It was cold, and the sky had no moon. I heard something on the porch, slow, steady steps. Not an animal scurrying, but deliberate, heavy human steps. They walked up to the door, paused, and stayed there. I held my breath for what felt like an hour, every muscle locked, the hatchet gripped in my hand. Finally, the steps moved again, scraping away from the door and circling the cabin. At one point, whoever it was tapped on the wall with something hard. Not loud, just a slow, rhythmic tap like they wanted me to know they were there. By dawn, when I finally opened the door, there were muddy handprints across it, smeared as if they dragged their palm back and forth while I sat inside shaking. That morning, I made my choice. I packed my sleeping bag, my lantern, and what little food I had left. I didn't care if I got lost in the fields. I wasn't waiting until November. I walked for hours, following the sun east, pushing through dry cornstalks until my arms were scratched raw. I didn't stop until I hit a gravel road. A passing truck finally picked me up around noon, and the driver stared at me like I was crazy when I told him where I'd been staying. He didn't ask questions, just dropped me in town. I never went back for the rest of my things. Later, I heard bits and pieces about that farm. The landowner eventually had the barn torn down after squatters kept showing up. No one mentioned who they were or how long they'd been living out there, just that it wasn't safe. All I know is this: I wasn't alone out there in that cabin. Every night I stayed, someone was watching, waiting, moving closer. And if I hadn't left when I did, I don't think I'd be here writing this now. I was 36 the year it happened, living in northern Minnesota, not far from the Canadian border. The winter had been long, and by late March the snow still clung to the ground in heavy piles, the nights dipping well below freezing. I had taken time off work to get away for a week, figuring I would stay at the cabin my uncle left me when he passed. It wasn't much of a place, just 2 rooms with stove, a small porch, and a shed out back, but it was tucked deep into the trees, far from any road. That was the point. I wanted quiet. Getting there was the hard part. I had to park my truck at the end of an unplowed logging road and hike the last mile in with a sled to haul food, firewood, and a jerry can of fuel. The snow was waist deep in spots, the kind that breaks through a crust and swallows your boot. By the time I reached the cabin, I was sweating under my coat, but the air was sharp enough that it froze against my face as soon as I stopped moving. The cabin smelled like dry pine and cold ash, exactly as I remembered it. I got a fire going, unpacked my things, and stacked the sled against the shed. I told myself this trip would be about peace. Reading, chopping wood, maybe walking the frozen lake if the weather held. But I had no cell service out there, and the nearest neighbor was at least 4 miles away. That fact, though comforting in theory, became something different by the second night. The first day passed quietly. I melted snow for water, cooked a can of beans on the stove, and spent hours just listening to the fire pop. Felt good, simple. At dusk, I went out to get more wood. The woods around the cabin had that strange silence that comes in winter, where every little sound carries. I heard what I thought was a branch snap, sharp and close. I froze and scanned the trees, but there was nothing. I chalked it up to the cold making the trees crack and went back inside. That night I woke to a noise outside. Not an animal cry, not the wind. It was steady, deliberate. Footsteps, slow, crunching through snow, circling. I lay on my cot staring at the ceiling, holding my breath. I told myself it had to be a deer or maybe a coyote nosing around the shed. But the sound didn't move off into the woods like an animal would. Stayed moving around the cabin, deliberate and slow. After what felt like an hour, it stopped. I stayed awake until the fire died and the cold crept in, too afraid to move toward the window. In the morning, I forced myself outside. The air burned my lungs, the frost biting at my face. I walked the perimeter of the cabin. That was when my stomach dropped. Footprints. Human. Not boots like mine, but something flatter, smoother, pressed deep into the snow all around the cabin. They circled, paused near the windows, then trailed off into the trees. I stood staring, feeling more exposed than I ever had in my life. Whoever had been out here had walked the place in the dark, looking in while I lay inside pretending I didn't hear them. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but the truck was a mile away through deep snow. If someone was out there watching, that path was wide open. I told myself I could hold out one more night and leave first thing at dawn. I spent the day chopping wood, trying to look busy, but my eyes never stopped flicking to the tree line. That night, I barred the door with a heavy beam my uncle had kept for storms. I let the fire burn brighter than usual, thinking maybe the glow would make whoever it was keep their distance. Hours passed in silence, but around 2 in the morning the noise came back. The same crunch of footsteps, only closer this time. I could hear them just beyond the wall, stopping, starting again, circling. Then something tapped against the window. Not hard, just a single click like a fingernail. My whole body went cold. I didn't move. I just sat there on the cot with my hunting knife in hand, staring at the door. The tapping didn't come again, but the footsteps dragged out for hours, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. Eventually, just before dawn, they faded. When I stepped outside in the gray light, the prints were worse than before. Whoever it was had stood right against the walls, close enough to touch the logs, moving window to window. There were no animal tracks mixed in, no snowshoe marks, just those same flat impressions, pressed heavy into the crust. I didn't waste another minute. I stuffed my gear into the sled and started hauling for the truck. The snow was deep, every pull a fight. My nerves were raw, my head swiveling with every crack of ice in the trees. About halfway down the trail, I saw something that stopped me cold. In the snow just ahead were more footprints. Not mine, not from before, fresh. They cut across the trail, coming from the woods and heading back toward the direction of my cabin. Whoever it was had been nearby, watching, maybe even following. I didn't stop to think. I pushed forward until my arms burned and my legs felt like lead. The air stung my throat and sweat froze against my skin, but I didn't slow until the truck came into view. My hands shook so badly I dropped the keys twice before I got the door open. The engine coughed to life, loud and rough, but it was the best sound I'd ever heard. I drove that truck down the rutted road faster than I should have, chains rattling, until I hit the county highway. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never went back to that cabin. A week later, I called a local to go up and board it shut, and a few months after that, I sold the land altogether. I didn't care about the money, I just wanted no ties to it. Sometimes I think about those footprints circling in the night, the sound of them pacing in the snow, the tap at the glass. Whoever it was never tried to break in, never spoke, never showed themselves. That was worse than if they had. It meant they were patient, deliberate, and enjoying it. Out there in the frozen dark, with no one around for miles, they had all the time in the world. And I realized as I drove away that morning, if I had waited one more night, if I had stayed thinking I could tough it out, I might not have made it out at all. I was 28 years old when I decided to spend a weekend alone at an old hunting cabin that had been sitting empty for decades. The place belonged to a distant uncle who had passed away years before, and no one in the family bothered to maintain it. The cabin was small and rough, sitting on the edge of a thin patch of woods in North Carolina, just past an overgrown graveyard that had been swallowed by weeds and thick grass. The family graves stretched back over 100 years, stone slabs leaning at odd angles, names worn away by time. It wasn't a proper cemetery, just an old family plot that had been left to rot. The cabin itself was not far from those graves, maybe 100 yards at most. The path leading to it was barely visible, a line of dirt half hidden under grass and weeds. I had to push branches out of my way as I walked up. It was late September, and the air had that heavy dampness you only get in southern woods. I carried a backpack with food, a flashlight, a hunting knife, and a couple bottles of water. I thought it would be good to stay there for a couple nights, clear my head, and see what it was like to live in the kind of place my uncle had spent his life. The first impression of the cabin was bad. The roof sagged near the middle, and the boards along the walls looked gray and brittle. The front porch leaned downward, one corner sunk into the dirt. When I stepped inside, the smell hit me immediately: mold, damp wood, and the faint odor of animals that had made their homes there. The inside was one open room with a stove in one corner, a narrow bed frame with no mattress, and a table that was covered in dust. I spent the first hour clearing out the place. I brushed away cobwebs with a stick and swept the floor with a broken broom I found leaning against the wall. I checked every corner for snakes or rodents. The cabin didn't have electricity or plumbing, so I kept everything simple. I lit a couple candles I had brought with me and placed them on the table. Outside the windows, the thick woods pressed close, and through the trees I could just barely see the tops of the crooked headstones in the graveyard. By the time the sun started to dip, I was already uneasy. It wasn't the graves that bothered me, but the silence. The woods were quiet in a way that didn't feel normal. Usually you'd hear crickets, birds, something, but there was almost nothing, just the occasional rustle of leaves. As the darkness came on, I cooked a small meal on the stove using a camping burner, then sat at the table eating in silence. The candlelight made shadows move across the walls, and the old boards creaked every time the wind pushed against the cabin. I tried to read from a book I had brought, but I couldn't focus. I felt like the silence outside was pressing against the cabin. After I finished eating, I stepped out onto the porch. The night was dark, darker than I expected. There was no moon, and the sky was thick with clouds. I could barely see the outline of the trees. I turned my flashlight toward the graveyard, and that was when I noticed something that unsettled me. One of the gravestones looked freshly disturbed. The grass in front of it seemed turned over, as if someone had dug into the soil. I thought maybe it was just animals, but the shape looked too clean. It looked like someone had been digging there recently. I told myself it was nothing, just erosion or a trick of the light. I went back inside and locked the door with a rusted bolt. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something faint outside. Not footsteps exactly, but movement. Leaves shifting, branches snapping. I told myself it was deer moving through the woods, but the sounds came too close to the cabin for me to believe that. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a scraping noise, like wood against metal. My heart pounded as I listened. It was coming from the direction of the porch. I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark, holding my knife in my hand. The noise stopped after a few seconds, but I didn't sleep again. When morning came, I opened the door slowly, expecting to see nothing. But on the porch, right near the doorframe, there were marks on the wood. Thin lines, like something sharp had been dragged across it. They weren't there the day before. I thought about leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to admit I was scared. I told myself it could have been raccoons or some other animal. I spent the day exploring the woods and avoided going near the graveyard. But as I walked deeper into the trees, I kept feeling like I wasn't alone. I found cigarette butts near a fallen log, and they didn't look old. Someone had been out there recently. That night was worse than the first. I barricaded the door with the table and kept my knife close. Around midnight, I heard it again, the sound of something outside. This time it was clearer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My chest tightened as I held my breath and listened. The footsteps crunched over leaves, stopped for a while, then started again. I turned off the flashlight and sat in the dark, straining to hear. Then came the sound of breathing. Not my own, but faint, just outside the thin wooden wall. I stayed frozen for hours, knife in hand, until the noises finally faded away. I don't know how long I sat there before exhaustion forced me to close my eyes. When the sun came up, I knew I had to leave. I opened the door cautiously. The dirt around the cabin showed prints, human prints, leading toward the graveyard. My throat went dry as I followed them with my eyes. They stopped at the same grave I had seen disturbed. The dirt there looked worse now, like someone had been digging again during the night. That was enough for me. I packed my bag fast, not bothering to eat or clean up. As I was leaving, I noticed something carved into the wood of the doorframe. Fresh cuts, not weathered. It was a single word scratched in shaky letters. Stay. I didn't look back. I walked fast down the path, back to where I had parked my car on the dirt road. My hands shook as I started the engine. The whole drive out, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me out of the woods. I never told anyone in my family about what I found there. I don't know if it was some drifter using the graveyard to hide things, or if it was someone with darker intentions. What I do know is that the cabin is still there, still standing beside that forgotten graveyard. And whatever was out there that night, it wanted me to stay. But I left, and I won't ever go back. I still think about that week in the autumn of 2011 when I stayed in that cabin in Northumberland. I was 31 at the time, tired from work, and I wanted some quiet away from the noise of the city. A friend had told me about a small, affordable cabin for rent near Kielder Forest. It wasn't much, just a single-bedroom place with wooden walls and a tin roof, but I didn't care. I wanted silence, trees, and maybe some walks by the lake. I packed my things, drove north, and by the time I pulled onto the dirt track leading to the cabin, the sun was already dropping behind the trees. The cabin looked older than I expected. The wood was weathered and gray, and moss crept up one side. The door stuck when I pushed it open, and the inside smelled like damp timber mixed with the faint trace of old smoke. The living area was just a small room with a fireplace, a table, and 2 chairs. There was no television, no phone signal, just a few lamps and an old rug that felt gritty under my boots. The bedroom was barely large enough for the double bed and a dresser. Everything was functional, nothing more. I remember standing in the middle of that room with my bag, hearing nothing but the soft hum of the wind outside, and feeling a kind of loneliness that was different from what I felt in the city. It was heavier somehow. That first night was uneventful. I cooked some pasta on the small stove, read by lamplight, and listened to the quiet. Around midnight, I switched everything off and lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the trees moving outside. There was no sound of cars, no voices, just the occasional creak of the cabin as it settled. Eventually, I drifted off. The second day, I went for a walk along a muddy trail behind the cabin. The forest was thick, damp, and quiet, and the sky stayed gray all afternoon. When I returned, I noticed the cabin looked more isolated than I had realized. From a distance, the little building seemed swallowed up by the trees. I didn't see another person the whole day. Not a hiker, not a neighbor, nothing. Just me, the damp path, and the sound of my boots sticking in the mud. That night, I sat by the fire, reading again. At some point, I glanced out the front window, more out of habit than curiosity. The cabin's single window looked out toward the dirt track I had driven in on. The glass reflected some of the firelight, but I could still see the yard outside. That's when I noticed movement. At first, I thought it was the wind shaking the branches, but no, it was lower, slower. My eyes adjusted, and I realized there was someone standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the track. A woman. She was tall, thin, and wearing something long that blended into the trees, maybe a coat. She wasn't moving much, just standing there, facing toward the cabin. I froze in the chair. My mind started racing through explanations. Maybe it was a hiker who got lost. Maybe someone from a nearby cottage. But I hadn't seen a single house on the drive-in, and she was just standing there. Not waving, not walking, not doing anything but watching. I got up and moved away from the window, my chest tight. I didn't want her to see me watching her. I turned off the lamp, letting the fire burn lower, and tried to look again from the corner of the window. She was still there. It was hard to make out her face in the dim light, but the way she stood made my stomach twist. Her arms hung stiff by her sides, her posture straight, like she'd been rooted to the ground. I don't know how long I watched, but eventually I couldn't see her anymore. The fire burned down, The clearing got darker, and when I finally dared to press my forehead against the cold glass, the space where she had been was empty. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the cabin made me tense. I kept imagining footsteps on the porch or a shadow moving outside the window. By morning, when the light started to seep in, I convinced myself I had overreacted. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe someone was just passing through the woods. It didn't make sense, but it was the only way I could function. The third evening, after another long walk, I came back to the cabin and checked the clearing immediately. Nothing. Cooked, ate, and tried to relax. When darkness fell, I sat near the fire again, staring at the pages of my book but not really reading. My eyes kept flicking to the window. Hours passed, and just when I started to believe nothing would happen, I caught movement again. My heart jumped. She was back, this time closer. Instead of standing at the edge of the clearing, she was halfway across it, about 20 feet from the cabin. I could see more now. Her coat looked ragged, long enough to brush the tops of her boots. Her hair hung down in tangled strands. She wasn't moving, just facing the cabin in the same stiff way. I didn't go to the window this time. I backed away, turned off the fire, and sat in the dark, holding my breath. I don't know how long I sat there, but when I finally risked another glance, the clearing was empty again. The next morning, I decided to leave. I had planned to stay for a week, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I packed quickly, barely eating, and walked outside to load my car. The clearing looked normal in daylight. Muddy grass, damp leaves, mist still hanging low. But when I walked to the car, I noticed something in the mud by the track. Footprints. Not mine. These were smaller, narrower, pressed deep like someone had stood in the same place for a long time. They led from the trees toward the middle of the clearing, then back again. I drove away, heart pounding, checking the mirrors constantly. The trees seemed to close in around the road, and I felt like at any moment I would see her standing by the side. But I didn't. Eventually, the woods thinned, the road widened, and I made it back to the motorway. I never told the rental agency why I left early. I just said something came up. When I got back to the city, I tried to push the memory down, telling myself it was probably just some local, maybe someone with issues wandering the woods at night. That explanation was easier than the alternative, that she had been there for me specifically, watching. It's been over a decade since then, and I still see that image in my head. A thin woman in a long coat, standing silent in the dark, closer each night. I don't know who she was or what she wanted. I just know that if I had stayed one more night, maybe she would have been right outside the cabin window. Maybe closer, and I'm glad I'll never know. I was 37 the year I decided to take a solo trip up north into the thick woods of Maine. It was late October of 2009, the kind of time when the air bites at your skin in the mornings and the leaves are mostly dead on the ground. A friend of mine had told me about a small hunting cabin his uncle used to use years ago. It had been left empty for a long time, but he said it was still standing and I could use it if I wanted. I had always been drawn to being alone in the woods. It made me feel like I could breathe again. Life back home was nothing but noise, traffic, work stress. I wanted the opposite, silence and space. The drive up was long. I took old roads that twisted through endless trees, passing small towns with shuttered gas stations and quiet diners. The deeper I got into the woods, the less I saw of people. By the time I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, my phone had lost service hours ago. The dirt road was rough, filled with rocks and muddy dips. My truck bounced and rattled until I finally saw it. The cabin looked smaller than I imagined. It was built of dark logs, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. A chimney stuck out at the far end. The windows were dusty, and the door leaned a little. It looked tired, but it was still there, still holding itself together. Behind it, the woods stretched deep, thick with pine and oak. Inside smelled like dry wood and dust. The floor creaked under my boots. A small iron stove sat in the corner, with a stack of rotting firewood beside it. The furniture was bare. Just an old table, 2 chairs, and a cot against the wall with a thin mattress. There was no running water, no electricity, nothing but the bare bones. I liked it, felt cut off from the world, just what I came for. I spent the first couple of hours cleaning. I swept out mouse droppings, cleared spider webs, and dragged in fresh firewood from the woods. The stove worked, but it smoked a little before pulling the draft right. When I finally sat down that first evening, the fire crackling, the woods outside already black, I felt good. I ate jerky and beans straight out of the can, then stretched out on the cot, listening to the popping of the fire. The quiet out there was so deep it almost felt heavy. At home you never get silence, always a hum of cars, voices, machines. But here, when the fire burned down and the wind eased, there was nothing. Nothing but my own heartbeat in my ears. The first night I barely slept. I wasn't scared, not exactly, but I was alert. Every crack outside, every rustle in the brush, pulled me awake. At one point in the night, I heard something heavy moving around out back. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a bear, but it kept me stiff on the cot until it finally wandered away. The next day, I hiked out early with my rifle slung over my shoulder. I wasn't after anything specific, maybe deer, maybe just small game. The forest was endless, and I quickly lost track of how far I'd gone. The ground was covered with dry leaves that snapped under my boots, and the air was cold enough to sting when I breathed deep. I saw nothing for hours, not even a squirrel. By the time I turned back, the sun was already sinking. I pushed harder, worried about losing the trail. The woods looked different in the fading light. Familiar shapes became strange. Every tree started to look like the last one. My chest tightened when I realized I had wandered too far, that I wasn't sure where the trail back was. I forced myself to stay calm, to look for broken branches or boot prints. It took me nearly 2 hours, but I finally saw the cabin roof through the trees just as the sky turned dark. I was exhausted, but something about the cabin felt off when I came back. The door, which I knew I had shut tight, was cracked open an inch. My stomach turned cold. I stood there for a long time, rifle ready, waiting, listening. Nothing moved inside. Finally, I pushed the door open. The fire was dead, the air colder inside than out. The chair at the table was pushed back a little farther than I remembered. That was it. Nothing else. Nothing missing, nothing broken. Maybe I had left it open without realizing. Maybe I had bumped the chair. I told myself that, but the feeling in my gut didn't go away. That night, I stacked more wood in the stove and kept my rifle leaning against the cot. I stayed awake longer, listening harder. Around midnight, I heard it again, movement outside. Heavy, steady steps circling the cabin. Not running, not rushing, just circling. My hands gripped the rifle so tight they hurt. The sound went on for what felt like an hour before it drifted off into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. The following morning, I found prints in the mud by the door. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet, human. They were wide and long, the toes clear in the wet dirt. Whoever it was had been barefoot in near-freezing weather, circling my cabin in the night. My first thought was to leave right then, but the truck was half a mile down the road where the dirt path ended, and I didn't want to load everything up in the dark if whoever it was still around. I decided I'd last one more night, leave first thing in the morning. That evening, I kept the fire low, not wanting the light to shine through the windows too bright. I sat at the table, rifle across my lap, listening to the woods. Hours passed in silence. I almost started to believe I'd hear nothing, that maybe the prints were old, maybe not even real. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. Footsteps again, closer this time. They stopped right at the wall by the window. The wood creaked as if weight leaned against it. I didn't move. My whole body was locked in place. Whoever was out there stayed there for a long time, breathing. I could hear it, slow and heavy. Then the handle of the door rattled. Once, twice, a slow push testing it. My stomach twisted so hard I felt sick. I had bolted it from the inside, but the wood was old. I aimed the rifle at the door, finger tight on the trigger, heart pounding so loud I thought it might give me away. The rattling stopped. The breathing faded. After a while, the steps moved off into the woods. I stayed up until dawn, staring at that door, not blinking. When the sun finally came, I packed everything in less than 10 minutes. I didn't even eat breakfast. I shoved my gear into the truck bed and sped down that dirt road faster than I should have, the whole time watching the tree lean in the mirror. I didn't see anyone, not once. I never went back to that cabin. A week later, curiosity got the better of me and I looked up old reports from that county. Buried in the local paper was a short piece about a man found living in the woods not far from where I had been. He had been breaking into camps and cabins, stealing food, sometimes just watching people. He had no shoes, no real clothes, nothing but rags. They said he had been out there for years. When I read that, I thought about the bare footprints in the mud, the sound of someone breathing just inches away from me through the wall, the door handle turning in the middle of the night. I thought about how easy it would have been for him to break in and how no one would have found me for days. That was the last time I ever went to a cabin alone. I was 32 the year I decided to spend a week alone in a small rented cabin tucked deep into the hills of northern Montana. The year was 2017, late October, and the cold had already started to creep in earlier than usual. The cabin itself wasn't anything fancy. A single room with a loft above, a small wood stove in the corner, and walls that seemed thinner than they should have been for that kind of weather. I had brought my dog, Bear, a 6-year-old German Shepherd, because I never liked the thought of being completely alone out there. He wasn't just a pet. He had instincts sharper than mine, and if something felt off, he would know it before I did. The first 2 days went by quietly. I chopped wood, cooked simple meals on the small propane stove, and hiked the narrow trails with Bear running ahead. The nights were long and darker than I remembered. No glow of distant cities, no highway noise, just a blackness that pressed against the windows and a silence so thick I could hear the blood in my ears when I lay in bed. The isolation was heavy, but it was the kind of heavy I had come for, a break from everything. On the third night, the wind picked up. It rattled the loose boards on the porch, made the trees groan like old beams in a barn. I fed the stove more wood than usual, watching the flames flicker orange across the cabin walls. Bear was restless, pacing near the door. At first, I thought he was just reacting to the storm, but then his ears pinned back, his body stiffened, and he stood frozen, staring at the door. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably a deer moving through the brush. But Bear didn't relax. He growled low, that kind of deep rumble in his chest that meant something wasn't right. I turned off the lantern and stood there in the dark, my eyes straining at the window. The wind hissed through the cracks, carrying with it a sound I wasn't expecting, the crunch of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving just outside the cabin. I didn't move for a long time. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I could feel my skin prickle like it knew before my mind did. Bear stayed locked on the door, hackles raised. The steps moved around the cabin, circling, sometimes stopping altogether, then starting again. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide it. They wanted me to know they were there. I reached for the hatchet I had left by the wood box and gripped it tight. My palms were sweating even though the cabin was cold. I didn't open the door, didn't say a word. I just stood there with Bear until the footsteps faded back into the wind. But I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust outside, I thought they had come back. The morning brought no comfort. I stepped outside with Bear at my side, my breath hanging in the cold air. The ground was damp from the storm, and the mud gave up clear tracks. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints, large ones, circling the cabin just as I had heard. They cut off toward the tree line, disappearing into the dense woods. I told myself maybe it was a hunter, maybe someone lost. But there had been no knock on the door, no voice calling out for help, no truck parked on the old dirt road where I had left mine. Whoever it was had walked to that cabin in the middle of the night and stayed long enough to make me know it. The next 2 days dragged like weeks. I barely left the cabin, only stepping out to let Bear relieve himself or to grab wood stacked against the shed. I didn't hike, didn't wander. I kept the hatchet near and the rifle, which I had leaned in the corner, closer than before. Bear seemed constantly on edge, his ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. Sometimes at night he would sit upright, staring at the wall like he knew something was moving just beyond it. On the 5th night, it got worse. I woke up to Bear barking, sharp and loud, the kind of bark that meant warning, not play. My chest clenched as I scrambled from bed, grabbing the rifle this time. I tried to listen past Bear's noise, and that's when I heard it. The soft scrape of metal on wood, coming from the back wall of the cabin. I killed the lantern and pressed myself against the far wall, Bear beside me. The sound came again, like someone dragging a tool along the boards. Slow, steady. Then it stopped. I waited, the seconds dragging until I thought I'd go mad from it. Then the footsteps came again, right outside, circling, pausing by the windows, moving to the porch. The boards creaked under weight, heavy weight. I aimed the rifle at the door even though I couldn't see a thing. My mouth was dry, my body shaking so hard the barrel quivered. Bear's growl was constant, vibrating through the floor. Then silence. Minutes passed, then maybe an hour. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake until the gray of dawn crept in, and only when the light was full did I step outside. The boot prints were fresh again, circling, stopping at each window, the porch. But there was something else this time. A long scrape across the back wall, right through the wood, deep enough to leave a scar, like someone had run a blade hard against it. That morning I packed my things. I had rented the cabin for 2 more nights, but I couldn't stay. I loaded the truck with my gear, Bear jumping in the passenger seat without being told. Before I left, I took one last look at the cabin. It sat quiet in the cold light, smoke still drifting from the last fire I'd made. It looked harmless, small, almost inviting. But the marks in the mud, the scar in the wood, and the feeling still crawling under my skin told me the truth. Someone had been there. Someone who hadn't wanted food or warmth or help. Someone who had only wanted me to know I wasn't alone. The drive back down the mountain road was slow and tense. Every shadow between the trees felt like it could step forward. Every bend in the road made me grip the wheel tighter. Bear finally relaxed only when the highway came into view, his body easing as if he knew the danger had been left behind. When I finally reached town, I sat in the truck outside a diner, Bear's head resting heavy on my lap. I should have told someone, the sheriff, the ranger, anyone. But what would I have said? That I heard footsteps, saw tracks, marks on the wood? It wouldn't matter. Whoever had been out there was gone now, and they had chosen to vanish as quietly as they had appeared. Even now, years later, I can't forget the sound of those steps circling, slow and patient, as if time didn't matter to whoever was out there. And I can't forget the way Bear, who never feared anything, stood stiff and trembling at that door. That cabin is probably still standing. Maybe someone else is staying in it this winter. Maybe they're chopping wood right now, warming their hands by the stove, feeling the wind press against those thin walls. And maybe, when the night comes, they'll hear what I heard. The slow crunch of boots in the dark, circling, waiting for them to realize they are not alone. I was 36 years old the first time I stayed alone in that cabin. It was in the hills of northern Arkansas, about 40 miles outside of Harrison, far enough from town that once I left the highway and wound down the narrow gravel roads, I barely saw another soul. The cabin itself wasn't mine. It belonged to a friend of my older brother's, someone who let people use it if they wanted to fish or just be away from everything. I wasn't much of a fisherman, but after a long stretch of working back-to-back shifts at the plant, I thought I could use a weekend to myself. The place sat at the edge of a thick line of trees, pine and oak mostly, with a clearing in front that opened into a sloping field. The roof had a layer of moss on the north side, and the porch leaned just a little when I stepped up on it, but the cabin was sturdy. The inside smelled like dry wood, old cigarette smoke, and something faintly musty, like it hadn't been opened in months. It was simple. One main room with a bed in the corner, a little wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a small shelf with some canned food that looked old but still sealed. I had brought my own cooler with some meat and drinks, and I had enough firewood stacked on the side of the house to last me a week if I wanted it. My plan was simple: cook, sleep, maybe walk down to the creek that ran about half a mile downhill through the woods. No TV, no service on my phone, no one bothering me. The first night was calm. I grilled a piece of chicken outside on a small rusted grate someone had left leaning against a rock, then sat on the porch as the light drained from the sky. The tree line turned black as the last bits of blue faded, and the crickets started up loud. Every now and then I heard something bigger move in the woods, probably a deer. It didn't bother me. The air was cooler than it had been in town, and by 10 I crawled into bed with the window cracked. It must have been after midnight when I woke up the first time. I didn't know why at first, just that my eyes opened to the dark and the cabin was colder than I expected. Then I realized I could hear footsteps outside. Not an animal moving quick or scurrying through leaves, but steady, slow steps, crunching the gravel of the drive and then stopping. I held my breath. My heart beat so hard in my ears I thought it would give me away. I waited, straining to listen, and for a long time there was nothing. Just the insects outside and the occasional rustle in the trees. I told myself maybe it had been a deer after all, and eventually I drifted back to sleep. The next morning I stepped out and checked around. Nothing. No car tracks besides mine, no sign of anyone else. The gravel drive showed some disturbances, but I figured that was just from my own boots when I unloaded the cooler. Still, the thought of hearing those steps stuck with me. I tried to shake it off. I made eggs on a pan over the stove, hiked down to the creek, skipped some rocks across the shallow water. By the afternoon I felt normal again, like maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. That night, though, it happened again. I had just dozed off when I heard it, this time on the porch itself. The boards creaked under weight, slow, careful. My stomach tightened so hard I thought I would throw up. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Whoever it was stood there, just on the other side of the thin wooden door, close enough that I could hear a faint shift in their weight, like someone leaning slightly to look inside. I stayed frozen, gripping the blanket like it would protect me. After what felt like forever, the sound faded. Creaks down the steps, then nothing. In the morning, I looked again. The porch had new scuffs on it, faint marks like the edges of boots dragged across the boards. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, but they hadn't been there yesterday. That whole day I couldn't settle. I kept glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see someone standing among the trees, watching. I checked the cabin over, windows latched, door locked, but it didn't make me feel safer. That evening, I didn't bother cooking outside. I stayed in, ate some jerky and crackers from my bag, and lit a lantern. By 9, I was pacing the room. By 10, I was sitting in the chair with the lantern off, staring at the door. The footsteps came again, right on schedule. Gravel crunch, porch creak, pause. My hands were shaking so bad I pressed them against my legs to keep them still. Whoever it was stayed longer this time. I could hear breathing, faint, but there. Slow, steady, deliberate. Then I heard the softest sound, a fingertip brushing against the wood of the door, tracing across it. I didn't sleep at all that night. By dawn, I had already packed my cooler back into the truck. The only problem was the drive back. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow gravel path that wound 3 miles through the trees before it connected to the county road. As I pulled onto it, I noticed fresh tire tracks. Not mine, not from the owner. These were newer, pressed into the soft ground from the rain 2 days ago. They led up to the bend in the road and then turned off suddenly, straight into the woods where no path existed. I drove out fast, faster than I should have with the loose gravel, skidding around bends. When I finally hit pavement, I felt like I could breathe again, but I didn't slow down until I was nearly back to town. I never told my brother or his friend what happened. I just said I didn't care much for the place and left it at that. 3 weeks later, I saw a story on the local news. A man had been arrested in the hills near Harrison. He had been living out in the woods, breaking into hunting cabins, watching people at night. They found rope, knives, and a set of journals where he wrote about studying people before deciding what to do with them. They showed his face on the screen. I knew I had never seen him before, but the thought of him standing just inches away from me, night after night, made my stomach turn. I never went back to that cabin, and I never stayed out in the woods alone again. Some places are better left empty, and I learned quick that silence in the dark isn't always empty at all. It was 2 a.m. when I finally arrived at the cabin, deep in the Amazon. The air was thick with humidity, and the sounds of the jungle were both familiar and unsettling. The trees loomed like ancient giants, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out most of the stars. I could hear the distant calls of howler monkeys, the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush, and the constant, deafening chirp of cicadas. My name's Liam, and I was in my late 30s, a wildlife researcher who had spent the better part of a decade working in some of the world's most remote places. But this was different. I wasn't here to study wildlife, not really. The cabin was small, barely more than a shack, tucked away in a patch of land my old friend, Raphael, had owned. He had invited me down to help him with the project, but he'd been acting a little strange in the messages leading up to my arrival. Something about it had felt off from the start, but I brushed it off. What's the worst that could happen? I'd spent nights alone in the wilderness before. Still, as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The inside was basic. A single room with a small kitchenette in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed shoved into the far corner, the kind of thing you'd expect from a place in the middle of nowhere. But what caught my attention immediately was the smell. Pungent, musky, like something had died and was left to rot. I opened a window, hoping to air the place out, and as the cool night breeze blew in, I heard something. A crack, like a twig snapping somewhere nearby. My heart skipped a beat. The last thing I wanted was to be followed by something dangerous. The Amazon was full of predators, and not just the 4-legged kind. I made my way to the kitchen, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. The place was fully stocked with supplies, enough to last for weeks. Raphael had clearly prepared for my arrival, but why had he left without a word? The whole thing didn't sit right. I decided to make the best of it for the night. Tomorrow, I'd go out and start looking for clues about what he had been working on before vanishing. As I set up a small bedroll on the floor, I heard another sound. This time, it wasn't a snap of a branch, but a low grunt came from just outside the cabin. I froze, straining my ears. I reached for the small knife I always carried, tucked into the pocket of my jacket. The noise came again, a grunt, followed by a scratching sound. It was too deliberate to be an animal. Maybe a person? I couldn't imagine what anyone would want out here in the middle of nowhere, especially at this hour. My mind raced. I tried to tell myself it was just a boar or some other creature, but I knew better. No wild animal would make such noises. The cabin was isolated, too far for anyone to be out here unless they had some reason to be. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the door. Every creak of the floorboards under my feet sounded like a gunshot in the silence. I slowly opened the door, just enough to peek outside. The beam of my flashlight swept across the small porch, and I froze. There, standing just beyond the edge of the light, was something or someone. At first, I thought it was a man hunched over, but then I saw the shape more clearly. Something much larger, something much more massive. It was covered in thick, dark fur, and its eyes gleamed yellow in the dim light. It wasn't a person. Panic surged through me, and I stepped back inside, slamming the door shut with all my strength. I could hear it now, heavy breathing, followed by the scraping of claws against the wood. Whatever it was trying to get in. I rushed to the windows, shutting the shutters tight. My hands were shaking, and I realized just how alone I was. No one knew I was out here, not really. Raphael hadn't been in contact for days, and as I listened to the sounds outside, the feeling of being watched grew even stronger. I had no phone signal, no radio. There was no way for me to reach anyone, and no one would be able to hear me out here if something went wrong. I grabbed my backpack and began to rifle through it, looking for anything that might help. The sound of scratching grew louder, more frantic. The creature, or whatever it was, had found something to dig into. I could hear its claws raking against the wood like it was trying to tear its way in. I was trapped. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out, but the thought of running into the jungle, in the dark, terrified me. There were predators out there, real ones, not whatever that thing was. The cabin had a small supply of food, so I decided to wait it out until morning. Surely, by then, whatever it was would leave, right? Hours passed. Every creak, every rustle of leaves outside made my heart skip. It felt like the entire jungle was holding its breath. The creature outside was relentless, scratching and scraping, pacing around the cabin like it knew I was inside. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to find Raphael. I needed to figure out what the hell was going on here. Just as dawn began to break, the scratching stopped. I peered through a small crack in the shutter and saw that the creature was gone. I waited a few more minutes, my heart still racing, before I finally dared to open the door. The morning light filtered through the trees, and everything looked almost normal. The jungle was alive with birds and insects, the usual symphony of the rainforest. But there was something wrong with the ground. Tracks, deep gouges in the dirt, led off into the trees. Whatever had been outside, it wasn't something I could explain. It was too large, too unnatural. I decided to follow the tracks. The forest was dense, the air thick with the smell of damp earth, but I pushed forward. Hours passed and still no sign of Raphael. I started to question whether I'd ever find him. And then I stumbled upon something, a small makeshift camp, tattered tents, crates, and broken equipment. But there was something else, something far worse. Blood, pools of it, some dried, some fresh. My stomach churned. Whatever had been in the jungle with me was here too. I wasn't just dealing with an animal, I was dealing with something else. And it was clear now, Raphael hadn't just disappeared. He had been taken, dragged off into the jungle by whatever had left those tracks. I didn't know if I was going to make it out of there alive, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to leave. The Amazon wasn't a place for people like me. And whatever was hunting me, whatever had been hunting Raphael, wasn't something I could fight. I found my way back to the cabin. The scratching was gone, but the terror wasn't. My only hope now was to survive long enough to escape this place, before whatever it was came back. I was 34 the year I decided to drive up into the mountains of northern Idaho. It was late October, the leaves mostly gone, the trees standing bare like skeletons against the sky. A friend of mine had told me about an old hunting cabin that had been left behind years ago by a retired logger. He said it still stood, though no one used it anymore. It wasn't marked on any official map, but if you followed a dirt road that cut off Highway 95 for about 7 miles, you could reach it. I wasn't looking for adventure or anything like that. I just needed a place where no one could reach me for a while. I'd been dealing with too much noise back home. Neighbors, traffic, constant calls from work. The idea of sitting in a cabin with nothing but the wind, the trees, and my own thoughts felt like a relief. When I pulled onto that dirt road, I knew right away that it wasn't kept up anymore. The gravel was thin, the ruts deep, and the edges were washed out. My old Chevy pickup bounced and rattled over every hole. The further I drove, the narrower it became. I kept waiting for a sign of another vehicle, some tracks in the dirt, but all I saw were deer prints and broken branches. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the sky had already turned gray. The cabin was smaller than I expected. A single-room structure made of weathered pine, roof patched with old tin sheets. The windows were dirty but intact. The front steps sagged when I stepped on them. Inside, it smelled of wood rot and old smoke. There was a narrow bed frame against one wall, no mattress, just rusty springs. A wood stove stood in the corner with a pipe that ran out through the roof. The floor was rough and uneven, creaking with every step. I unpacked slowly, setting my duffel bag against the wall and pulling out a sleeping bag. I spread it over the springs and laid my flashlight next to it. The silence inside was heavy. No hum of appliances, no faint buzz of electricity, just the sound of the wind outside. That first night, I sat on the steps with a can of chili heated on the stove. The air smelled like wet earth, and every so often I'd hear a branch snap in the woods. It didn't make me nervous at first. I figured it was deer moving through the underbrush, maybe elk. When I finally went inside and shut the door, I felt calmer than I had in months. But around midnight, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, but it was there, wood shifting like a floorboard groaning. I lay still, eyes open in the dark, trying to figure out if it came from inside or outside. My breathing sounded too loud in my own ears. I told myself it was the cabin settling, maybe the wind pushing against it. I stayed awake for another hour, flashlight in hand, before exhaustion pulled me back under. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. The ground was soft with pine needles, damp from the night. That's when I noticed the tracks. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints, leading around the cabin in a slow circle. The size looked close to mine, maybe a little smaller. I crouched down, touching the edge of one, and felt how fresh the soil was where the heel had pressed. These weren't old. They hadn't been there when I arrived. I stood there for a long time, scanning the trees. The forest was thick, the kind where visibility dropped after 20 feet. It was quiet, too quiet. I felt the weight of it settle in my chest. I told myself it could have been hunters, someone passing through. Still, I couldn't shake the fact that whoever it was had walked around the cabin while I was sleeping. That night, I tried to stay awake. I built a fire in the stove, sat with my back against the wall, and listened. The flames popped and hissed. Hours passed, and my eyelids grew heavy. Just when I was about to doze off, I heard it again. A sound outside. A slow crunch like a boot pressing down on gravel. My skin prickled, and I froze. The steps came closer, circling again. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Through the cracks in the window, I thought I saw the faintest shape moving, but it was gone as soon as I focused. I gripped the handle of my flashlight so hard my hand cramped. Whoever it was never tried the door. After maybe 15 minutes, the sound stopped. The morning light didn't make me feel any better. I walked the clearing again, and the boot prints were there, more of them this time, pressed deep into the damp earth. Whoever it was had stood near the steps for a while, then wandered off toward the woods. That day I debated leaving. The road back wasn't far, and I had plenty of daylight. But stubbornness got the better of me. I had come here for quiet, and I wasn't about to let some stranger drive me off. Still, I kept my bag packed and ready by the bed. On the third night, the pattern changed. I had built up the fire again, and I was lying half awake in the dark when I heard the first sound. Not footsteps, but a scrape against the wall, like something sharp dragging over wood. My throat went dry instantly. Came again, slower this time. Then silence. I forced myself to move, lifting the flashlight and aiming it toward the window. Nothing, just my reflection faintly against the glass. Then the sound came from the opposite wall, closer this time. I could feel my pulse hammering in my neck. The dragging stopped, and for a long while there was nothing. When morning came, I finally worked up the nerve to step outside. On the side of the cabin, etched into the wood, were lines. Not deep carvings, just shallow scrapes, but enough to see someone had been dragging a knife or some sharp object across it. They were uneven, like they'd been made in the dark. That was enough for me. I packed my bag, stuffed my sleeping bag back into the truck, and didn't waste time looking back. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Every shadow between the trees looked like someone standing there, watching me leave. By the time I reached the highway, the tension in my chest hadn't eased. Even now, years later, I can still picture those boot prints circling the cabin. Still see those fresh scrape marks in the wood. Whoever had been out there hadn't tried to hide it. They wanted me to know they were there, and that was the part that unsettled me the most. Not that I'd been watched, but that whoever it was didn't care if I knew. They had all the time in the world, and I was the one who finally ran.